Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event, the lecture by Sergei Guriev, entitled Economics of Populism and Hybrid Regimes. My name is Carsten Schneider, and I welcome you with at least two hats on. As Prorector for External Relations, I welcome you on behalf of CEU. We are glad and honored that you have found your way to us here in Wien Favoriten, and I also welcome the numerous people who are joining online this event. I also warmly greet you on behalf of CIVICA, the European University of Social Sciences. CIVICA is an alliance of top social science universities in Europe. That is the CEU, Sciences Po, Bocconi, LSE, the Hertie School in Berlin, the UI in Florence, SSE in Stockholm, SNSPA in Bucharest, the EI in Madrid, and the SGH in Warsaw. Together with Sergei Guriev, I'm chairing the research part of the CIVICA University Alliance, and we happen to have a kick-off meeting today, and this is why we are happy to have Sergei here with us. The lecture today is part of a series of lectures, and Adam Sadowkowski, head of the Econ department, will explain a little bit more about the series. They are given by Massimo Morelli from Bocconi and Adam Seidel from CEU. And as a responsible person for CIVICA at CEU, I'm particularly pleased to see how this alliance, this CIVICA network, is fostering cooperation among faculty and staff, both within and across the alliance, and to the benefit of all. Finally, as a political scientist, I'm very much welcoming the initiative of our colleagues from the Econ department to organize this lecture series. The topics of all three lectures, populism and alternative realities, are of extreme importance. Just listen to the news from Brazil, and very much relate to what also keeps us busy over there in political science. So I'm very much looking forward to the talk today. And once again, we're warmly welcome and pass the floor to Adam Sadowkowski, head of the Econ department.
Let me welcome you on behalf of the Department of Economics and Business. As Carsten already mentioned, this is a series of talks, and importantly, this is not only for economists. We firmly believe that you cannot really understand society in general and politics without understanding the economic aspects, and this series of talks help you in all economists and non-economists to understand an economic aspect of these issues. So the first talk will be today on political economy of populism and new non-democracies. The second talk will be on February 8th. It will be offered by Massimo Morelli from Bocconi. And Massimo will talk about, given its consequences, can populism be long-lasting? Thinking about the economic consequences of populism. And the third talk will be offered on March 22nd by Adam Seidel from CEU, talking about the political economy of alternative realities. So I do encourage you to join the upcoming events and do sign up for our newsletters about these events. And also I want to give a special thanks to my colleague Arieta Mucho, who helped organize this series, to help figure out whom we should invite. And without her, the series would not have happened. So thank you very much. And I'd like to pass on to our rector and President Shalini Randera to introduce our speakers. So please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to all of you. I'm the third speaker this morning before you get to our speaker, so I'll be brief. But I think although many of you may know some of his work, I would like to welcome him formally at CEU, because this is your first public appearance at CEU, so it's important that we do this ceremoniously. Sergei Guriev currently serves as Provost of Sciences Po in Paris, which he joined in 2013. His arrival there marked the well-deserved culmination of an outstanding academic and also an administrative career from his earlier positions, where he was rector of the new economic school in Moscow. In another sense, however, his relocation from Moscow to Paris was just as much a result of individual choice and recognition of extraordinary professional accomplishment as of political persecution, which makes exile, even voluntary exile, the only viable alternative if one wants to survive the pressures of oppressive regimes, something that Sergei describes here as very harmlessly as non-new democracies today. But I think we will see some of the harshness of these regimes very clearly. Doing full justice to his many academic achievements is impossible in a short time. I'm going to mention just a few things. He's also leader of the Populism Research Policy Network at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London, and a global member of the Trilateral Commission, a member of Academia Europaea. Between 2016 and 2019, he was chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He's published in all the important economic journals, but he's also been writing widely in the New York Times, Financial Times, Washington Post, Project Syndicate. His latest book is the one that I would like to recommend to everybody who hasn't had a look at it yet. It's called Spin Dictators. Spin Dictators is written together with Daniel Treisman. It's a fascinating account of the changing character of authoritarian politics in the 21st century, because it looks at these pseudo-democratic illiberal regimes, what I've called soft authoritarian regimes, how soft they are. We need to then look in context, but one of their softness, Russia is not a very good example, but one of their softness is the use of the rule of law to subvert law. The use of law to subvert the rule of law in most of the context, rather than always using overt violence. Not true of Russia. But they exert formidable influence over electorates through psychological manipulation, selective repression of dissent, media control, and of course artful propaganda. This new style of dictatorship relies on the formalities of democratic legitimation, which it needs. It's based on, as we will hear today, the interdependencies and economic integration, much more than mere physical force and the open crushing of opposition. So it's important that we link the political economy of these regimes to their populist appeal, and in short, to the crises of liberal democracy in the 21st century, which needs a critical reckoning with the far-reaching effects of capitalist globalization in the neoliberal era, the mismanagement of endemic crises, and ultimately supporting the way in which these hybrid regimes make their policy appeal and somehow seem to be irresistible. Now, this is a very bad note on which to begin a new year. I should greet you all probably trying to minimize this doom and gloom, and I hope that Sergei will not only give us a diagnosis of the political economy, but he'll also show us some ways of undoing the power of spin dictators and their acolytes. So with this, a warm welcome to you, and you have the word.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carsten, Adam, and Shalini. You've already pretty much covered what I wanted to talk about, and you were right on target. So indeed, it's a talk about the two major challenges to 21st century's democracies, one coming from populists, one coming from the new breeds of authoritarian regimes. And indeed, there is I highly recommend a book which just came out with political scientist Daniel Treisman. And indeed, this is also a spirit of how we need to study the challenges of modern world, working across disciplinary borders and connecting to our colleagues throughout the world. The book per se is based on several papers we published in journals with Dan on those issues, but this book is for general audience, as Adam would recommend, appealing not only to economists. And then there is a survey which we wrote with Guriev and Papaioannou, which just came out in Journal of Economic Literature called Political Economy of Populism, where we study hundreds of papers which describe the recent rise of populism. And of course we include our discussion of papers of the forthcoming two speakers, Massimo Marelli and Adam Zeil, who've contributed to this literature with really, really important and insightful contributions. So I'm really encouraging you to attend the next two talks. So there are many questions which you can raise when you think about those issues. Why now? Why at the same time populists and new autocrats attack the liberal democracies? The next question is, should we worry about this? How dangerous that is? The next question is it the same trend or a different kind of species? And the next one is, what should we do? And basically the way I'm going to talk about this, I will first talk about populists, and then I'll talk about dictators. And then in the end of the day, I'll try to differentiate how similar or different they are. Overall, the idea here is that we'll come back in the end of the talk to the issues that I raised. So on populists, again, the major questions are: what is populism? How do we measure populism? And how do we quantify the rise of populism? Is the recent rise of populism unprecedented, or is just media attention paid to the recent rise of populism is sufficiently scary? And then, what are the drivers of the recent rise of populism? If the recent rise of populism is significant, why now? What drives it? What is so special about it? And so basically there are several theories talking about cultural drivers, economic drivers, interaction of the two, drivers related to technological change, the rise of mobile broadband, internet and social media, the issues related to secular trends such as globalization and automation, or one-off events such as, for example, global financial crisis 15 years ago. Then the next question is, should we worry about this? What are the implications of the rise of populism? And then what can we do about this? That's the question, which I'll try to speculate on. So basically, just to give you an impression, people talk a lot about populism after 2016. The main dividing line was in 2016. If you look at Factiva, which is a database on media, look at mentions of populism and populists, you see that it was 2016 when journalists started to talk about populism. When you look at Google searches, same thing. When you look at academics, in academia it takes time to write papers, so it started off in 2017. But it was actually 2016, Trump and Brexit, where people really started to worry about populism. Now, what is populism is not an easy question to answer. And this is what I'll try to talk about briefly, because without my co-author is Greek, so he says that we need to refer to Socrates, and Socrates said, without wisdom begins with the definition of terms, right? So we need to define what populists are, and if you look at literature on populists, they really struggle about this, and sometimes in the public domain we talk about populists as people we don't like, politicians we dislike. And essentially, whoever we don't like, we call a populist. But of course, that doesn't help when you want to measure things. You need an operational definition which can help you categorize politicians and political movements into populists and non-populists, and therefore being able to count to what extent the current rise of populism is different from what happened 100 years ago, for example. So in economics, until very recently, people would think about populism as left-wing populism in Latin America, and so if you actually look for an economics paper or book on populism, you would go all the way back to early 1990s, and that would be a book by Dornbusch and Edwards, which talks about left-wing populism in Latin America. And this is all about non-sustainable macroeconomic policy, deficit financing of budget, inflation, debt crisis, and so on. So this is not what current rise of populism is. And luckily, we have political scientists who have provided a different definition, and Cas Mude and Cristobal Rivera-Kaltwasser have worked on this way before 2016. And their definition of populism is much more pertinent to what is being observed today. It's not an ideology, or it's a thin-centered ideology. It's not left, it's not right. Populists can now be left or right, or not clearly define what they want. But this is a view of the world where the society is divided into corrupt elite and moral people, and the society should be run by the moral people. But the other argument here is that there is no heterogeneity within those two groups. So all moral people are similar to each other, and that, for example, implies you don't need checks and balances, because if everybody is the same, why do you need sophisticated political institutions? So are these definitions related? Yes and no. And I would like to mention this, that anti-elitism and anti-pluralism means you don't like checks and balances. But without checks and balances, you cannot actually provide a good investment climate, functioning political institutions, protection of rights, and eventually, as I will show, that leads to underperformance in economic terms as well. So more often than not, populists cannot deliver on their promises. Okay, let me now say a few words about measuring populism, and just say that in the paper we talk a lot about how difficult it is. You can measure share of seats, you can measure share of votes, you can measure the rise of populism in different samples of countries, and all of that luckily gives you similar results. So let me, for example, give you the populist vote share in Europe in the 21st century. So however you classify parties, populist parties, you end up with the same measure of populist vote share in Europe in the 21st century, and the picture is the same. Slow growth in the first decade, very fast growth in the second decade, and you go up from 10-15% share of the vote to 25-30%. It's huge. As you can imagine, it's really huge, and so these people start to get into government. And so, not surprisingly, when you look at the data from Funke, Šularik, and Trebesh, on populists in power, what they do, they look at 60 largest countries in the world, and they look at governments where at least one member of the coalition was a populist. You see that today, a quarter of those countries are run by populist governments. So it's an increase which indeed happened in the 21st century on the left and on the right, and it's unprecedented. We've never seen so many countries being run by populists. At that point, Bolsonaro just won an election in Brazil. As Carsten mentioned, we still don't know what's going to happen, but looks like he's also recognizing that Bolsonaro recognizing that Lula should be a president, but still, these are things which are happening. Anyway, so just take away, we are living in an era of unprecedented populism. I am happy to take questions on how COVID era played out, COVID years played out. It was a very special period. We also cover research on this. But basically, I would say, and for me, it's actually a very important incentive to be an economist. I think the analysis of what happened 10 years ago during the aftermath of the global financial crisis provided lessons for how to handle the COVID crisis, and that helped to avoid increase in populist vote share during COVID crisis. Anyway, so when I said there are plenty of drivers of populism, and in the paper we go one by one, there is huge literature. Some of this literature is actually much better. Some of this literature is very descriptive, but overall, you look at impact of globalization, look at impact of technological change and automation. 2008-2009 global financial crisis and its aftermath, austerity. And then we look at non-economic factors. Their results are sometimes very strong, sometimes reasonably weak, and sometimes strong and controversial. And so just to tell you why it's important to distinguish between economic and non-economic factors. If we face an economic driver of populism, for example, austerity causes populism, which is, to jump ahead, is true, was true, then by avoiding austerity, you reduce the rise of populists. Now, why we need to prevent rise of populists, that's something that I'll mention later on, but the good thing is we know how to handle economic shocks. Cultural factors, much harder. But in most of the papers, culture interacts with economics. There is one exception, which comes from this country, Austria, which talks about Freedom Party of Austria, shift to anti-Muslim sentiment. And there is a paper which shows that this party actually appealed to what happened during Ottoman sieges of Vienna. And there is evidence that they successfully conjured this sentiment out of thin air before financial crisis. That particular rise of Freedom Party of Austria was due to their cultural crusade without any economic factors. Anyway, so let me actually jump quickly through this, but just to say that yes, there is evidence that imports from China leave people behind, and if you don't compensate those people, populists pick up their votes. Automation leaves people behind. If you don't help these people, that creates fertile ground for populists as well. So there is evidence on that in the US and in Europe. Global crisis is also a perfect opportunity because it originates elsewhere. Non-elected bureaucrats from Brussels or Washington screw up. Corrupt bankers from some other country steal your pensions. And so this is a beautiful opportunity for populists to attack the corrupt non-elected elite. So let me skip this, but just to say there is a fundamental feature of current globalization and automation trends, secular trends, to increase inequality in the labor market, because people with blue collar skills and also routine white collar jobs are hit first and foremost by those trends, and so the jobs in the middle of the skill distribution disappear. So on the crisis, I would just tell you that there is a lot of evidence that this crisis mattered. And one of the charts I would show you, this is a chart which is coming from our own paper with Elias and Evgenia Passari and Jan Algan. If you look at subnational European regions and look at the change in unemployment before and after the crisis, there is a huge variation, as you can imagine. And you will see that there is a strong correlation between change in unemployment and change in voting share of the populists. So if you're in a region where unemployment increased a lot because of the crisis, and we also do a causal inference there as well, you also have an increase in populist vote share. The same is actually for Brexit. Brexit is a special case because you can go at a much more granular level, and also it's not a parliamentary election, so it's not part of the previous chart. Sorry, but Brexit is a special case where crisis also matter. Now, non-economic explanations. Here you have lots of questions because there are issues related to identity, issues related to security. There is a famous argument about cultural backlash. So for 50 years you have the cultural silent revolution where new generations are more tolerant, more liberal. But then there are white middle-aged men looking like me who don't like this revolution, who don't like relative power shifting to minorities, and that creates a backlash. And this is again a fertile ground for populists. Now, let me accelerate. Let me just tell you that immigration became a salient issue in many countries, and some people would say, "But wait a second, why? Why people care about immigration? Don't we have just 3% of global population being immigrants and this number is stable over the years?" The answer is yes, on average in the world. So on average in the world, foreign-born population has been 3% and is 3%. But if you look at developed countries, we do have a major increase in number of foreign-born people. And that, of course, creates a question. And of course, once you create an alternative reality, you can even multiply this number even further. So there are papers that show that if a country has 10% of foreign-born population, like most European countries, average resident believes it's actually 30%. This is the case in France, but France is no exception. But in general, I would just say that the recent few decades had a major increase in immigration, so that's why immigration is a salient issue, and that creates a vicious circle of creating alternative reality, talking about salient issues, and so on. And of course, that was also a one-off shock of refugee crisis. In the previous time I visited CEU, at that point it was in Budapest. It was not a public talk like this, it was a normal economic seminar, but I actually present my own research on this, and I show that in Central and Eastern Europe, the refugee crisis of 2015-16 was managed especially badly, which created major anti-migrant phenomenon. Now, another thing I would quickly talk about, because I think it's extremely important, and Brazil is no exception to this, because Bolsonaro has actually been elected as a WhatsApp president. His campaign was completely digital and WhatsApp, and used features of WhatsApp at that point, which made fact-checking difficult. But so basically we live in an era, the second decade of this century is an era of a very fast growth in internet penetration, and most of this penetration is through mobile broadband internet, which is the technology for social media. And again, Facebook of 2006 is not Facebook of 2012. They introduced like button, and suddenly social media started to live in a very, very different way. But basically, the takeoff of mobile broadband technology is exactly the second decade of this century, and this is when we have huge growth in mobile broadband penetration, and that is related to populism. We have a paper which came out last year in Quarterly Journal of Economics, which shows that regions in Europe which have more broadband, mobile broadband, 3G and 4G technology, is more likely, those regions are more likely to elect populist politicians. So this is impact of spread of mobile broadband technology since 2007 on elections, on vote shares of right-wing populists and left-wing populists. And basically, the average coverage moved from 40% coverage to 95% coverage in Europe. And that per se can explain half of the rise of populist vote increase in Europe. Interestingly, non-populist opposition doesn't benefit from mobile broadband technology, because non-populist opposition's message is not as easy to communicate through social media. Social media is conducive to communicate simple messages, sometimes false messages, messages of disturbing nature, dark messages, critical messages, and so we shouldn't be surprised. And if you want, I can talk about previous generations of new information technologies such as radio, telegraph, cable TV, which previous generations of populists also used. But there is something extremely worrisome about this generation. And if you have questions, I'm happy to elaborate on this as well. Green parties also didn't benefit from the spread of 3G and 4G. Now, very quickly on what populists do when they come to power. Basically, the simple narrative that you have in mind is populists come to power, don't do well in economy, understand that they don't do well in economy, cannot deliver on economic promises. So what they do next, they destroy political competition to stay in power, not to be kicked out of office. And that's exactly the narrative that a lot of papers show. There are exceptions. For example, Polish populists are doing pretty well economically. But basically, there are methods which allow you, and this is Brexit paper, for example. There are methods which allow you to construct a counterfactual. So, what British economy would be without Brexit? What you do before Brexit, you build a doppelganger of British economy, which is a weighted average of other developed countries, and then you extrapolate the performance of this doppelganger after Brexit. And you see that the doppelganger outperforms Brexit economy by a significant margin, by about 1% of GDP per year. So if you actually calculate 1% of GDP, you end up with something like 350, 400 million pounds per week. That's exactly the number that they said they will gain and put it on the bus during the campaign because of the Brexit. But the reality is exact opposite. And so this is the same picture zoomed in. Anyway, so this paper, Funke, Šudarik, and Trebesh do this exercise for all populists in the last 100 years, and they show that after 15 years, once populists come to power, GDP is lowered by 10% relative to counterfactual. And that relates to rising protectionism, destroying courts and media freedom, And also they show that populists are very unlikely to just normally step down after losing an election. This is the populist performance versus the counterfactual. You see that after 15 years it's about 10% below than it should be. Anyway, so just quickly before moving to dictators, what is populism? I think this is a very important takeaway for non-political scientists in the room. Populism is definable. There is a consensus on definitions, and the minimum definition is anti-elite and anti-pluralism. Now, what are the recent drivers? Economic factors, yes. Crisis in particular, yes. Role of mobile broadband internet, yes. On culture, the evidence is actually more descriptive. On immigration, there are lots of very well-identified studies, very rigorous studies, which give you opposite effects. If migration is managed well, if migration is not too big, if migrants are integrated, then you have empathy and you vote less for anti-immigrant populists. And that's evidence which shows that in many countries, including this country as well, Austria. There's a paper on Austria which shows that communities which got Syrian refugees allocated, and at that point it was about 1% of population, were integrated well, they voted against Freedom Party of Austria. But if you have a badly managed refugee crisis, such as Greece or Central and Eastern Europe, transit migration rather than settlement, you don't have empathy, you have rejection, and you vote for populists. Now, on populists in power, they mostly underperform. As I said, Trump, before COVID, actually performed exactly like doppelganger. No up, no downward difference. Poland is a big exception, but overall, populists are bad for economy. Now, what should be done? So I mentioned already avoiding austerity, taking care of people who are left behind. On non-economic side, of course, mainstream politicians should be more active on social media. We also need to reform social media, and that already started after Russian interference in American elections in 2016. We also need to innovate in political sphere, thinking about participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, and that's already started, and it seems to work pretty well. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to talk about this. Now, in the remaining 6 minutes, I will say a few words about spin dictators. But Shalini already discussed that, so I don't need to talk too much about this. So this is a recent book that we wrote with Dan Treisman. It's a book for general audience, but it's based on a lot of data, and the data and replication code are on this website, spindictators.com. The book is going to be translated into Hungarian, 10 other languages as well, but Hungarian in particular. And the reason for that is that the book is about exactly the new authoritarians, which are different even visually from the old generation. So if you look at the old generation dictators, they all wear military uniform, even if they are not military themselves, right? Some of these people are real generals. Some of these people have never been generals before becoming dictators. But if you look at today's authoritarians, they wear business suits, they go to Davos, they talk about themselves as popular and competent leaders. And that's a very, very different breed. And it's actually, in a sense, good, because when they say we are Democrats, we can infer that they like democracy because people like democracy. They want to pretend to be Democrats exactly because democracy is more popular than terror. But still, it's still a list of non-democratic leaders which do concentrate power, do eliminate political competition through manipulation of information, not through fear. And that's basically the central idea. Now, some dictators still practice the old style repression-based model. And again, I just give you a visual of Putin 2.0. By now you probably call Putin 5.0, 6.0, but we call him 2.0 because we think that the nature of the regime changed exactly last year. And we wrote a new preface for the book saying that we observed a transformation of the regime, which luckily we predicted in the first draft of the book we said it's plausible. But now Putin is much more likely to talk to people in military uniform. And interestingly, the last New Year address of President Putin was recorded. He was still wearing a civil suit, but he was in front of soldiers. That's never happened before. Before, he would be in front of the Kremlin, like a Western leader. Today, it's already changed. And so basically, the central idea is the new generation of autocrats manipulates information to convince the public that there are normal, democratic, maybe imperfectly democratic, but democratic leaders, popular and competent. And that's the idea. Don't use open repression. If you use repression, use it in a hidden way. Deny it. Say, if I put this person in jail, that's because he's a crook, not because he's a political opponent. So that's the simple idea. And one of the things I would just say is when we classify regimes, we show that this model, dictatorship based on spin, is now much more popular, much more representative of modern non-democratic regimes than before. And majority of today's regimes are dictators, like spin dictators. So let me now skip through all of that, but just give you a couple of citations from quotes from those people. This is Colonel Gaddafi, who started in the age when fear dictatorship was the prevalent model, ended 10 years ago when he was already antiquated. And he was famously saying the spin model is bad. We need to use open repression. So whenever other leaders run people over the cars or poison them, we don't do this. If we execute somebody, we execute them on television. And the old Vladimir Putin would say exactly the opposite. Well, somebody like opposition leader got killed in front of the Kremlin. That's a provocation against me. I don't know why he was killed. And this is a typical thing. Let me skip through. We talk about manipulation of elections, new methods of this. We also analyze speeches. So it is important that these people talk like Democrats. So what we do, we measure the number of violent words like terror, enemy, fear, punishment in the speeches. And then we also do things like economic performance, public good provisions, schools, unemployment benefits, and so on. And then we look at speeches of democratic leaders and fear dictators and spin dictators. And we find statistically that there is no distinction between speeches of spin dictators and democratic leaders, while both are statistically different from old-style dictators, who talk much more about violence and much less about economy. So this is just a short list. Basically, you pretend to be a democracy, so you have some opposition media. Sometimes you co-opt opposition media, and I'm sure Adam Zeidel will talk about this. He wrote a very important paper on Hungarian ways of doing censorship. The censorship is also denied and covered. That's very important, and this is a wonderful trick about censorship, because you can censor information about censorship itself. So majority of the public will think that there is no censorship because they don't have information on censorship, because information on censorship is censored. And strikingly, and we show that with the data, that people in such regimes, especially less educated people, think that their media are free. And this is again something is a very important feature of those regimes. Now let me say why is it happening. It's happening because those regimes are better fit for today's reality of cross-border flows of technology, information, people, goods, and services. And they allow this, and they benefit from this. And we think that it is exactly this modernization and technological change that moved the balance from fear dictatorship to spin dictatorship. So basically, if you think about how modernization affects political regimes, 60 years ago, Lipset wrote a famous paper and then a book that modernization should bring political change from dictatorship to democracy. Well, it's not literally this. It's a prerequisite for democracy. In a sense, what he says is educated middle class is something which helps to consolidate democracy and so on. So it's a very complex argument, but people sometimes simplify it like this. Our argument is even more nuanced. First and foremost, when we talk about modernization, we talk about global modernization. So basically, if you have technological progress in Silicon Valley, it affects regimes in the East and in the South. When you talk about CNN and YouTube, that also changes the calculus of going for various ways of staying in power. And then the other thing is, we think that modern dictators can delay democratization, but at some point they actually face the challenge. And the challenge is that in order to continue growing the economy, you have to face a growing, creative, educated class, and eventually you need to figure out what to do about this. But in a sense, it's still a more sophisticated argument than just modernization causes democratization. Modernization causes evolution, almost Darwinian evolution of dictatorships, from fear dictators to spin dictators. It's a better fit species of non-democratic regimes. However, once you face the challenge that you have too many educated and unhappy people, what do you do? Well, to students and faculty at CAU, I don't need to tell you what happens when leaders think that there are too many educated people who have critical thinking. So you sometimes that results in democratization, and we talk about examples like Armenia or Ecuador. Sometimes they go back to open repression. And don't get me wrong, Hungary is still a well-defined spin dictatorships. But sometimes you have movement back in time, and Venezuela is a great example where Chavez was a spin dictator and Maduro is a fear dictator. And today, of course, Putin moved from before war spin dictator to 2022 fear dictator, where he uses open repression. No independent media exists. Now, what shall we do? Shalini asked me to give some solutions. We actually have a whole chapter of solutions. There are no simple answers. We think that engagement is still important, because if you can engage with civil society, you can promote dissemination of information, that's the battleground where you fight against spin dictators. The battleground is in the informational sphere. So if you can engage civil society and help civil society to disseminate information, and this, of course, is where universities is the main battleground, you should try to do that. And this is why dictators would love to stop those engagements and try to do other engagements where they instead can disseminate their corrupt influence to the West. And this is what needs to be stopped. We talk a lot about why corruption is not the bug, but the feature of those regimes, and why exporting corruption for them is an essential tool, and that is and must be stopped. Enablers of those regimes have to be prosecuted either by judiciary means if possible, or by reputational means. And another thing, again, I don't need to tell you, these regimes, by pretending being democratic, are very capable of capturing and subverting international organizations. Last year, EU has suffered a lot from certain members being too close friends of Putin. NATO is still suffering, where Turkey slows down accession of Sweden and Finland. UN Human Rights Commission, I don't even need to start there, but they kicked out Russia. And Interpol is now run by a general from Emirates who is in France, accused of torturing people himself. So, but one of the things is narrative is important. And so if you support democracy, you need to take a high road. Sometimes it means you have to accept defeats. And once you promote democracy by invading countries, that gives fertile ground for spin dictators' narratives. So anyway, let me wrap up here. So spin dictatorship model is now the majority. It uses fake democracy, Potemkin democracy, if you like. It uses rhetoric, which is very different. And eventually, these regimes will also face difficulty in the modern world. But sometimes that means that they try to go back to the old model. And so we need to make sure that it doesn't succeed as well. For that, we need to support a critical mass of educated and critical people within. Now, just a few words about the relationship between the two. Are these guys similar, spin dictators and populists? Well, there are many similarities. So people like Berlusconi and Trump and Bolsonaro, populists, want to become spin dictators. But as we see, so far, these particular individuals have not succeeded. Some other individuals, including Viktor Orban, have succeeded. And this is where you see this link between populists who start as democratic politicians, destroying the checks and balances, political competitions, rule of law, become authoritarian leaders who pretend to be Democrats. In that sense, this link is very clear. Not all of them succeed, but also we should remember that some populists are democratic populists who accept democratic defeat. And then we also need to remember that one of the founders of the model of spin dictatorships, Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, was not a populist. So it's not one for one, but there is a link, and we should think about this link very carefully, because understanding those regimes is important. So let me stop here and take your questions.
Sergei, thank you very much for the talk. We'll have some assistants go around for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. We also have more than 100 participants online, and there's some online questions, and I'll read some of them. Meanwhile, while we wait for the first person to get a microphone, I'll ask one of my first questions that comes from online. So, do we understand how AI and big data tech will affect or support the rise of populism in the world? For example, it helped China to watch and control citizens. So this is our first question.
So this is a wonderful question, and for me, indeed, AI and China are the scariest. Is the scariest combination. And there is research now which shows this link, this two-way link, two-way relationship between spread of AI and authoritarian control in China. Roughly speaking, Chinese government gives a lot of data to AI companies, Chinese AI companies, to train their algorithms for face recognition, walk recognition, and so on, to increase repression and to prevent protests. And there is evidence, causal evidence, which shows that it works. And then AI companies, private sector AI companies, are extremely happy about this because they have a lot of data, they train their algorithms much better than their European competitors can do, because here we do have GDPR, privacy laws, and so on. So AI companies get data, train their algorithm, and sell private sector solutions to supermarkets, for example, right? And so there is this vicious circle, which may result in a situation where authoritarian government is very powerful, and moreover, this government is getting ahead in technological race against the democracies. Remember that in previous reincarnations of, for example, in the Cold War, eventually Soviet Union lost technological race because centralized systems are not very good in encouraging innovation. Top-down innovation usually doesn't work. But here you have a special technology which needs big data, and because of disrespect for privacy, you may actually end up with this particular case. Now, in our book, we talk about China, but our book is basically about fear dictators and spin dictators, and China is in its own category. Basically, we call China fear dictatorships based on digital technology, digital fear dictatorship, because open repression is there, but it's actually done in a very sophisticated way. So it's not North Korea, it's not Syria. It's a very sophisticated regime which uses AI and big data, and we should be scared about this. So if you ask me what really scares me, or doesn't let me sleep well at night, this is one of those issues. That is a fundamental factor that may actually create a situation where China gets ahead in technological race. Now we see that Chinese dictators also make mistakes, so there is hope, but yeah.
So the next question will be from the floor. Just please keep the questions brief so we get to everyone. Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Jeff Manners. I'm a retired insurance executive who's worked many years in Central and Eastern Europe, decades actually. Curious as to your views, are there internal contradictions within this model of spin dictators? And are these a threat to its sustainability? And what would be some examples of it? I've often puzzled, let's say, with Trump. He seems to appeal to white nationalists, which then appeals to anti-Semitism. Yet, on the other hand, they tend to take a very strong view of supporting Israel, which strikes me as a rather puzzling contradiction. Anti-Semites who support a strong Israeli foreign policy.
Jeff, this is indeed striking how these people spin the narrative so successfully. And for example, I was also struck how Orban managed to turn the war into his advantage a year ago in the election. I didn't expect that, but we shouldn't underestimate the sheer talent of some of these people. They may not be international grandmasters, but the business of staying in power, that's the business where they're really world champions. Now, answering your questions about internal contradictions and spin dictatorship. So we identify one major contradiction and we back it by data. Basically, to take advantage of being a spin dictator, of being part of the global economic system, you need knowledge workers. Stalin was okay with people who could read and write, because that was industrialization-based growth. Now you have a post-industrialization era. You need people who can create, people who have tertiary education. Tertiary education is different from secondary because you have critical thinking. Whatever you do, even outside of CEU, universities teach critical thinking. And that is a natural implication of what we do, right? And this is the major contradiction. You want more of these people to remain productive so you can tell the rest of the population you're a competent economic leader. But the more of these people you have, the more difficult to silence them and prevent them from talking to others. If there are few critical educated people, you can co-opt them. Some of them are just get bribed with better jobs and so on. You can silence them in a quiet way by using targeted censorship, targeted repression. But if there are many, that suddenly becomes too expensive and too noticeable. And in that sense, that's the main contradiction. And that's where some of these regimes hit a wall, and they see that majority of people are against them. And it's no longer possible to convince them that it's a good regime.
So let's take another one from the audience, and then we go online, and then back to the audience.
Professor, thank you very much for your presentation, and thanks to EU for having you. So I'm Harvey Soden. I'm a former vice president of ABC TV in New York, and I worked in the Carter administration. First, one thing, you mentioned about President Putin and the military behind him. According to the New York Times, many of those people were not military, but they were actors, including the blonde woman who played another role in another photo op, let's call it. So my question as a former executive in a media company is, it's easy to say repair democracy, but when you have such power from social media and from the internet now, where it's very difficult to distinguish between who's legitimate, who's illegitimate, where people are coming from. How can you do this? Like in my country, in America, you know, we're more or less a free society. So how can you control the media and have a free society at the same time? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harvey. This is the key question in this research agenda. I'm actually working on this, on alternative facts, fake news, fact checking, and it's really hard. There are some tools. We need to regulate social media better. Social media, since 2016, said we are happy to be self-regulated. We'll change the way we work. And as a researcher in this field, I can tell that's not enough. It's not going to be enough. Their business model is contrary to the public interest, and there should be regulation. And there will be regulation. In Europe, there is already Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act. There will be antitrust cases in the US. And indeed, the business model of social media is to sell attention. Attention is attracted by exciting things, which are more likely to be false things. fact-checking is a public good. Market doesn't provide enough fact-checking. And so you need to impose fact-checking on this. Then you need to indeed find this battle against false experts, support reputational mechanisms that support experts. And in that sense, it's not an easy battle. And I would just give you an example from COVID. We also saw that during COVID, populist politicians stood up against vaccines because vaccination comes from experts. Experts are elite. It's a big conspiracy of Bill Gates and 5G for whatever reason to undermine the normal people. And basically, you would think that there is a natural selection process. You don't vaccinate, you die. Stakes are in COVID. Death rate was not high enough. It's not like Middle Ages when I believe in magic, you believe in science, you have better weapons, you kill me. Here, it's not enough. And you can survive. Our society is very tolerant to people who want to live in their alternate reality. So this is a huge, huge issue. And of course, the censorship is not an answer, but middle of the ground regulation of competitive media sphere is the answer. And mainstream media do fact-checking, and social media should also do fact-checking. You cannot have it both ways. Basically, for people who don't know American legislation, there is what's called Communication Decency Act, Section 230, which says media should be working like media. Social media are platforms. They don't do editing, which is false because they do ordering of the feeds, of the tweets, of the posts, which is editing, which is profitable for them. That's why they do this. And so regulation should be there. And of course, monopoly issues are also there. So I fully agree with you. This is a very hard issue, but we need to handle it if we want to preserve our democracy.
So there are lots of interesting questions coming in online. I apologize right now, we won't be able to cover all the questions. There's a few I chose here. One next, interesting question. Is there a connection between cancel culture and populism?
Well, yes. Yes, culture wars are very important to populism, and it goes both ways. And when it goes too far, you create polarization, and eventually, in polarization where you don't have middle ground, extreme right and extreme left both fight this war without possibility to find middle ground. But cancel culture is such a difficult question that I would rather not talk about it right now, because we need to be very detailed, very specific. So let's see.
Okay, we'll take one more from the audience and then one online here. But meanwhile, we are waiting for the audience. One online. How do economic and financial sanctions affect populist leaders and their narrative?
Wow. So if you can reduce economic growth in a populist country, it makes life of populists more difficult, because populists usually come with a promise of better economic performance. And one of the countries we can safely criticize from Vienna is Hungary. So if you look at Hungarian economic performance, if you do the same exercise like I showed you for Brexit, it turns out that the proud economic narrative of Orban is false. He underperforms the counterfaction. Other Central and Eastern European countries have done better. On top of that, the 3% growth of Hungarian economy before COVID is similar to 3% of GDP subsidies from Brussels. So every year, all economic growth can be explained by money coming through cohesion funds, which are explained by Orban's ability to convince Brussels colleagues that he's a perfect Democrat. And now the situation is more difficult. And if he's not getting this money, eventually it will be a big problem for him. Now he used the narrative related to the war, but eventually people will ask questions about his economic model.
Hi, Daniel Hardy, BAV in Vienna. I noticed that all the populists and spin dictators are all men, like indeed your questions from the floor. What do you think of the hypothesis that part of the rise of populism reflects a reaction by men to the loss of status and power vis-a-vis women? I've also heard, like, what's in the Philippines case particularly.
So you're right, and actually we struggle to find a woman in this population, and And the reason is indeed, as you said, relative power since 50 years ago is moving from men to women, which is how it should be. And then you have a backlash from men. That's exactly the point. And that's this idea of cultural backlash by Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris, who wrote a book about cultural backlash. When they go back to Silent Revolution, which is a paper and a book by Ronald Inglehart 50 years ago, showing how the rise of new generations are more accepting the gender equality, rights protection of minorities, and so on. And so populists often use the backlash, saying, look, you are forgotten, you're left behind, you're a middle-aged man, white man. And also it happens that these are the categories of people who lose in relative terms from disproportionately lose from automation and a competition with Chinese imports. So this is yet another issue. So these are the categories which are hit most, because these are the people who hold blue-collar jobs.
We'll take one last question from the audience.
Hi, Professor. My name is Dima. I'm a recent expat from Russia. It's delightful to see you in Vienna. I really hope that you can come here more often. So I have two tangential questions, if you can allow me. Can you talk about cases where populism and dictatorships have failed to democracy and why that happened? And then the other one is who is in the best position to counter populism and dictatorship?
Thank you. So the human history is providing actually an optimistic view. So 200 years ago, we didn't have any democracies, and now half of the world lives in democracies. That depends how you count India. And views are divided on India. So if India is an autocracy, then majority of population lives in autocracies now. If India is a democracy, majority of population of the world lives in democracy. And there are some political scientists who treat it as an autocracy, some political scientists treat it as a democracy. Anyway, still there are many more democracies than before. We know that democratization comes in waves. So neighboring country democratizes, you democratize with a higher probability. The third wave of democratization is apparently over. But I remain an optimist, and it's not just you, but also me. We're going to see the fourth wave. So, and the reason for that is that populists and autocrats do not deliver, including economically. And we already see problems in China. China has had all kinds of headwinds, but one of the big puzzles was how does post-Mao's leadership maintain the system of artificially created checks and balances, meritocracy, rotation. So every 10 years, people step down, leadership stands down, they prepare succession, they promote people who've done better running their province in terms of GDP growth. How without democratic mechanisms they manage to do that? Why wouldn't somebody say, thank you very much, I'm not stepping down. I think I am the best leader. I don't need to step down. And the explanation was maybe they remember the personality cult of Mao, how dangerous it is for the elites. And suddenly, finally, they decided to forget about this. And now we have a personalistic dictatorship. And personalistic dictatorship is not the best system to promote economic growth. And we've already seen many mistakes this machine has made. So we can be optimistic. Now, so democratizations have happened, and they will happen. I remain optimistic. Now, the very fact that spin dictators call themselves Democrats, once again, shows that democracy is the only game in town. The people want democracy. They don't want a Stalinist model. So that's good. Now, you're asking me who can win those battles. We need better political leaders who come from the center, who know how to use social media, who are well-educated. Society is complex. For example, regulating social media is difficult business, but also can talk to people. And that is hard. And that's what's called paradox of democratic leader. A lot of people say, well, we don't have good democratic leaders anymore. And the reason for that is society is complex, society is heterogeneous. You need very sophisticated people on one hand. On the other hand, these people should be close to the public, to the electorate. And that makes it almost impossible. Sometimes these people emerge. Barack Obama is a good example how you can combine both. But essentially, if you think about this, in the United States, 40% of voters have college degree, 60% don't.
96 or 100% of Congress people have college degree. So 60% who don't have a college degree, and in the US, it's a huge, huge issue not having a college degree, are underrepresented, to put it mildly. And so that already creates an opening for populist leaders. And I fully agree that sometimes it is mind-boggling how Trump, being a rich person with an Ivy League degree, calls himself a representative of people who are left behind. But still, there is an opening for people who can represent the ordinary people. And so we need to find leaders who are well-trained and at the same time have empathy and connection to the voters.
So unfortunately, we are running low on time, although I'm sure we would be happy to go on with additional questions. So I just want to remind you to please join us for the next two events, Massimo Morelli in February and Adam Seidel in March. And let's thank our speaker again, Sergei. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.